Okay, here's chapter 2, called A New Father. No sooner had I arrived in London and been joyously reunited with my mother and siblings than Mummy gave birth to David, the first of our half-brothers, and Colin and I were dispatched to Northamptonshire, to stay with some great aunts. Northamptonshire. To stay with some great aunts. It was snowing, and neither of us had ever been so cold. The only thing that kept our circulation going was an electric fire in our bedroom, which we were allowed to turn on. Neither of us knew anything about electric fires, of course, and one morning I put my icy cold clothes over it to warm, then began to play with Colin. When I turned around, my underwear was ablaze. We beat out the flames and hid the evidence. For a brief period before David was born, home was a small flat in East Putney, southwest London, and I was fleetingly enrolled in Hazeldean School nearby. All I remember of the experience was that we had sausages and baked beans for lunch on Wednesdays. The luxury of a day school was short-lived, however. My parents, my stepfather, Bobby, insisted on being called Daddy, moved to Wimbledon, and I was sent to boarding school in East Grinstead, Westcroft, in Victoria Drive. I was sent to boarding school in East Grinstead. Westcroft in Victoria Drive was a 1930s house that Bobby's father, an eminent surgeon, had bought for us. I can only assume that the arrival of a grandchild had brought about a change of heart in the doctor and his wife, and Bobby certainly needed the gesture. He and my mother had very little money. Having been paid extremely well by Dunlop to work overseas, he came back to his regular salary, and with 5 children and a wife to support, it wasn't enough. My new school was St. Agnes and St. Michael, another convent. I was driven there at the beginning of the first term, crying all the way, and for the first few nights I was so disturbed I wet the bed. I felt so humiliated and ashamed. At 10 or 11, I knew I was much too old to do such a thing. Desperate that no one should know, I covered the damp patch with a towel each night in the hope that the sheets would be dry by morning, and if anyone did find out, they never told me so. The dormitories were divided into cubicles with a curtain around each bed, like in a hospital ward. We slept on thin mattresses, and beside each bed there was a chair for our clothes at night and a little chest of drawers. My only comfort was Teddy, my beloved bear, who lived on the bed and listened patiently to my secrets every night. The uniform was navy blue, pinafore dresses with wide pleats worn over white shirts and ties, all neatly marked P. Boyd on the white name tapes that my mother had painstakingly sewn into every last sock. My tie was only ever tied at the beginning of each term. At night I loosened the knot and slipped it off over my head. We had a bath 3 times a week, according to a rota, and I have a feeling we changed our knickers 3 times a week, too. At that school, I felt like a fish out of water. I had nothing in common with the other girls. I hadn't read many books in Kenya, and television was still a revelation to me. I had only watched it for a couple of months. I couldn't even discuss my family. No one else had divorced parents. All I knew was Africa. I could talk about lions, zebras, and elephants and snakes coming into my bedroom, which didn't go down at all well. They would say to each other, "Don't talk to Pattie Boyd, she's mad." The convent was an old building with no central heating, just a few big radiators which we used to sit on in an effort to keep warm. We were told not to because that would give us piles and chilblains. I was always cold, particularly in winter. Sometimes I would feign illness to get a couple of days in bed where I would be warm. I would go to the matron, who would take my temperature. While her back was turned, I would whip the thermometer out of my mouth and run it under hot water for a couple of seconds. It worked. A treat every time, and I would be packed off to bed. The only compensation for winter was the daily dose of radio malt with cod liver oil, the most delicious, sweet, sticky goop that apparently kept colds away. Every day we would go to the dispensary and line up for a spoonful. Most people hated it. I thought it was nectar. I wouldn't wait for the holidays when I went home to Colin and Jenny. In the absence of my mother, emotionally, they had become all important to my sense of security, and I to theirs. We developed a strong bond, and when I looked back at photographs of us as children, we always seemed to be leaning on each other. That was how it felt at the time. It was us in the family and them. They were the grown-ups and represented everything that was unsafe and untrustworthy. Jenny had been the first to leave Kenya, and at 6, shy and on her own with no older siblings to support her, she was compliant. When I arrived, I think my stepfather could see trouble ahead and decided to nip it in the bud. He called Jenny to his study one night after she had gone to bed and wouldn't let me in. He told Jenny that she was the good girl in the family and Pattie was the nasty girl, and that she shouldn't listen to me because I was a bad influence on her. Jenny remembers going back upstairs and realizing, even though she was so young, that he was trying to divide and rule us, and that she had a choice. She could either be on their side or mine, and Colin's. As far as she was concerned, there was no contest. She had felt so unloved by our mother in Kenya, even before she left us there, that she had stopped looking to Mommy as a source of comfort and transferred that expectation to us. We were her family, not the adults. We were her safety net. I remember the incident vividly, sitting upstairs in my bedroom, furious that I had been excluded, unable to hear what was being said behind the closed study door, and desperate to know why Jenny had been called down without me. And then finally, after what seemed like an age, she came into my bedroom, closed the door tight, climbed into bed with me, and told me exactly what our new father had said. My stepfather was a frightening character, and we were all scared of him, including, I think, my mother, although she would never have said so. I thought he was a bully. He had loved his time in the army and treated us as though we were his own personal foot soldiers, wanting his boots polished, his food on the table, the children silent, and everything just so in the house. He was always telling us to stand or to sit up straight, always finding fault. Meal times were excruciating. I have no memory as a child of ever hearing or being part of a cheerful family banter around a dinner table. No one had spoken in my real father's house, and now we were not allowed to speak in my stepfather's. We ate in the dining room, which felt very stiff and formal, with hard, heavy chairs, and if any of us did anything at the table that displeased him, we would be sent to the corner of the room to stand with our hands on our head. We had to stay like that for a long time, and after a while it was agonizing. I remember Jenny once being sent into the corner for stirring her instant whip too vigorously. 1 minute she was harmlessly stirring her pudding, and suddenly go to the corner with your hands on your head. Of course, there were some happy times as well. Christmas was always fun, and Bobby would play Santa Claus. I know because one year I saw him. One day he was cross with all of us, Paula included, and said he'd had enough. He lined us up and took a photograph of us, which he said he was going to send to our father in Kenya and ask if he would take us back. For weeks and weeks, I waited anxiously for my father's response. terrified that I would be sent away. On another occasion, he lined us up in the garden, holding hands, and told me to put my hand on a part of the car engine. A shock surged through me, and via our linked hands through Colin, Jenny, and Paula. It might have been his idea of a joke, but it seemed odd to me. I also found it rather odd when he set fire to the end of my hair, saying it was very good for hair to be burned. We were occasionally beaten for small misdemeanors. He would tell us to bend over, and we would say we were sorry, knowing what the sting felt like. Paula remembers him delaying the beatings. He had clipped the edges of the lawn around the flower beds and asked her to pick up the clippings. She had decided it would be simpler to bury them, which she did. Bobby was furious and told her that he would beat her in 3 hours' time. 3 hours later, he sent Jenny to find a stick, but he said the stick wasn't thin enough, and the whole thing turned into a sick game. Paula begged him not to hit her. She promised she would give him all of her pocket money for the rest of her life if he didn't, but her pleading fell on deaf ears. One day he asked Jenny to close the drawing room door. She didn't hear him and continued whatever she was doing. So he repeated himself, and again she didn't hear him. Interestingly, he was partially deaf. He had lost much of his hearing during the war, so he tended to shout. Finally, he ran out of patience. "If I have to ask you to close that door one more time," he threatened, "I'm going to beat you." Poor little Jenny still didn't hear and ended up being beaten. He said, "It's not like you, Jenny, to be so rebellious. What is the matter with you?" The matter with her was that she had been camping the night before and had stuffed cotton wool into her ears to stop earwigs climbing in and forgotten to take it out. It was only when she developed a temperature and earache the next day that a doctor was called and the problem discovered. My mother never intervened in my stepfather's punishments. I think she was too frightened, and if you ask her about it today, she denies it happened. She will say what a kind and generous man Bobby was. I think she was eternally grateful to him for rescuing her after Jock, and was always eager to please him. She was also a product of her age, the last, perhaps, of the generations of wives who vowed to love, honor, and obey their husbands, and meant it, without question. So there was no point in going to her for protection. We had to look after ourselves, and we developed our own strategies for coping. As the eldest, I felt a great sense of responsibility for my siblings, and now with the wisdom of age, I realize Bobby was simply a product of his own upbringing. His father beat and bullied him, so he repeated the pattern and feels no shame about it. He now says that corporal punishment would sort out the young of today. Colin was probably beat more than the rest of us, and as a boy at boarding school at that time, he was used to it. But even he finally snapped. He had wanted to play a game with David in the garden one day, and Bobby said he couldn't. He was teaching David to read. Colin must have said something or made a face to provoke him. Next thing, Bobby took out a golf club and whacked Colin a couple of times. Colin grabbed the stick, which snapped in Bobby's hand, and as they wrestled, cut a jagged line into our stepfather's flesh, so deep he had to go to hospital for stitches. Later, Bobby told Colin that if he had still had a Luger in the house, which he had until a recent post-war amnesty, he would have shot him. Bobby had no idea how to handle us. The real problem was that he couldn't relate to children, didn't understand them, and probably didn't like them very much, at least not the rebellious, ready-made family he had acquired. He seemed to have a knack for bringing out the worst in us. If we didn't behave, the only way he knew of bringing us into line was by force. It didn't occur to him that showing us a little kindness might have earned him some respect, and we might have done willingly what he asked. His childhood must have been very Victorian. His parents were austere, and children in their eyes were to be seen and not heard. Colin and I went to stay with them once, and it was ghastly. They didn't like us, and their idea of a fun day at the seaside was to drive to Eastbourne, where we had to sit primly in the back of the car, which might have been a Daimler, with a flask of tea and a chocolate cornflake cake. We were only allowed onto the beach for half an hour. Bobby's sister became a nun and eventually committed suicide. Eventually, Bobby became sales director with Dunlop Tires. He was proud of the company, and I remember whenever we were out in the car, we played a game spotting Dunlop signs. Wherever we lived, Lily came with us. She had been in service since the age of 13 and used to tell us proudly that she had had half of her stomach removed. She wore a nylon housecoat with a pinny over the top and was seldom far from a cigarette. She had been with Bobby's parents for years and had no family of her own. She was wonderful. Everyone else in the house was uptight, but you could talk to Lily. The food she cooked was deeply dull and disgusting, but we loved eating in the kitchen with her on the rare occasions we could escape from the dining room when our parents entertained. Lily's joys in life were her weekly copies of Women and Women's Own and her cigarettes. I used to go into her room, lie on her bed, and look at her magazines. All the more exciting because my stepfather forbade me to read the love stories. Colin never let me down. That's her brother. Each holiday he would bring home from his boarding school some new boyish torture that he practiced on me. I remember Chinese burns being a special favorite, but my hours spent drying the cutlery after supper were not unproductive. I was a master at flicking a damp tea towel and regularly caught him on the back of the legs. I was not allowed to wear jeans, too revolutionary, experiment with makeup, or go out with boys. I remember joining a tennis club once, so I would meet some. There were two I fancied, Andrew Miller and Anthony Milner. And when one invited me to the cinema, Bobby wouldn't let me go unless Colin and Jenny came too. I was 16. He even censored what I watched on television. I was allowed to see the news and I Love Lucy, and he absolutely forbade me to see Jailhouse Rock, Elvis Presley's first film. It caused such a stir. Audiences went crazy, getting up and dancing in the aisles. I loved Elvis, but my stepfather thought I shouldn't be exposed to him, and that was that. My mother wouldn't allow us children to go to the cinema on our own. To this day, I never have been inside one alone. She also said we were never to sit next to little old ladies in case they were to stick hypodermic needles into us and spirit us away into the white slave trade. Where she got this idea from, I shall never know. But she had double standards. When she put me on the train to go back to boarding school, she would say, "Let's find a little old lady to look after you." One minute they were potential abductresses, and the next they were guardians. I was only ever driven to school at the start of the first term. After that, I took the train. I don't think it made me feel unloved. I could see that my mother was too busy to drive me to East Grinstead. She now had 5 other children. Less than 2 years after David was born, she'd had Robert, known as Boo. Occasionally, they would come down on a Sunday to take Colin and me out to lunch, and we would go to the Fellbridge Hotel in East Grinstead, where everyone else went with their parents. It was agony to watch all the other parents and children chattering over the roast beef while we sat in the usual silence. I was hopeless in English, hopeless in math, loved history, geography, and art, but that was due to the teacher, Miss Hill, who decided she would pay me some attention. She was the only teacher who was not a nun. My piano teacher was a nightmare. Every time I made a mistake, she would hit my hand with a ruler. Religion inevitably played a large part in my education. We had to go to church on Friday evenings and twice on Sundays. I have no idea why I was sent to Roman Catholic convents. We were Church of England. My mother was quite religious, and we went to church every Sunday. Yet at school I had a very different experience with priests, nuns, and lots of incense, which I loved. However, I had difficulty accepting much of what I was taught. How on earth could Jesus have been born from a virgin? How could he have risen from the dead? None of the nuns was prepared to explain anything. We had to take it all at face value. None of it was inspirational because they weren't, except one, Sister Mary, who I decided had probably had a tragic childhood or a crisis in her late teens. She had a passion for poetry and the written word. She helped me understand and learn to love it too. In 1958, when I was 14, we moved house again. My stepfather had bought a rather grand 8-bedroom Edwardian house called Gosmore in Hadley Wood, Hertfordshire, and I moved schools again. Later I discovered that my sudden departure from St. Agnes and St. Michael had led to rumors that I had been expelled. Nothing so glamorous. I wasn't nearly naughty enough for that. So my mother had to go through the usual last-minute panic of sewing name tags onto the new uniform. I had the trauma of that first day at a new school, getting to know a new building, a new routine, and having to make new friends. They were always sent to boarding schools. St. Martha's Convent was in Hadley Wood too, but I was sent there as a full boarder, and I remember yet again saying goodbye to my mother and fighting back tears as I watched her car disappear down the drive. I stood awkwardly with my trunk, not knowing a soul, and watching the other girls shrieking with excitement at the sight of their friends, then regaling one another with their exploits during the holidays. My dormitory had 12 narrow beds, each screened from the next by a curtain, with a wash basin at one end and a notice board with a list of do's and don'ts printed on it. Lights out was at 9 and no talking. That first night there was no talking, just muffled weeping as the less robust of us got into the ghastly routine. Every morning we were woken by a small nun wielding a large loud bell, which she rang up and down the corridors and in the dormitories. 10 minutes later she appeared again, chanting prayers. That was our cue to scramble into our uniforms, strip our beds, and race off to breakfast. There was compulsory chapel on Friday evenings and twice on Sunday, as there had been at my previous school. Different priests would take the services each week, while muttering incantations, swinging an incense burner. I found the heavy scent and smoke quite intoxicating. I never got over the dread of going back to school, and the ubiquitous smell of floor polish, ink, and pencil sharpenings, and the melancholy sound of someone in a faraway room practicing scales on the piano. But I enjoyed my time at St. Martha's. I made some good friends. I joined the Girl Guides, which I loved. I had been a brownie at St. Agnes and St. Michael. I played netball and tennis and was on the school teams. The best bit about matches was the orange quarters they gave us at halftime, and the tea we had at the end when we entertained a visiting team, cucumber sandwiches, and all sorts of cake, delicious. One weekend at school I was bored and found myself licking the honeycomb out of a crunchy bar. I licked until I had created a wonderful hollow inside the chocolate shell, and kept on until there was virtually no honeycomb left. Then I had a brilliant idea. I wrote to Fry's, who made crunchies, and explained that I was lonely and unhappy at boarding school, and my only pleasure was a weekly crunchy bar. This week, I continued, I had taken a bite and discovered that my weekly treat was hollow. I finished off my letter, yours weeping Pattie Boyd, put it into the post, and thought no more about it. 3 weeks later, a huge parcel arrived with Fry's stamped all over it. It contained one of every chocolate bar they made, and a letter saying how sorry they were that I had had a faulty crunchy. They hoped this collection would help to restore my faith and make amends. My feelings of guilt lasted about 30 seconds, and I was suddenly very popular with my friends. Sounds like something you do. Towards the end of term, we would stockpile our tuck for a midnight feast. One person would be designated to go around the dormitory waking everyone up, and we would make our way in dressing gowns and slippers, whispering and giggling, to the appointed secret destination. Here we were never caught. How we were never caught remains a mystery. I suspect the nuns recognized it as a bit of harmless end-of-the-term fun and turned a blind eye. Sadly, they viewed my having a copy of Lady Chatterley's Lover hidden under my pillow as a much more serious offense. Yeah. I was made to report to the Reverend Mother, who was furious. She threatened either to expel me or to tell my stepfather. I couldn't decide which would be worse. It was the first sexy book I had read, and I found it riveting. I knew nothing about sex. My mother didn't talk about it, and at that time there was no sex education in schools, and certainly not in a convent. When I had my first period, I thought I was going to die. I was about 13 and woke up one morning to find the sheets covered with blood. Luckily, I was at home and ran to my mother in a state of great alarm. She didn't explain anything, just changed the sheets and gave me sanitary towels. At about that time, I remember messing around with Colin when he knocked into me. My chest hurt, which it never had before, and Mummy said rather ominously, "You can't play with your brother anymore. He might hurt you." All our information came from friends at school, and it wasn't entirely accurate. Jenny remembers me telling her the facts of life when she was very young. I went through what the man did and, with great anxiety, explained that afterwards the woman bled forever and ever. According to Bobby, the reason we moved away from Victoria Drive was that property prices had gone up in Wimbledon, and the geographical area he was responsible for at Dunlop had increased. So in moving to a cheaper house at Hadley Wood, he could make money. Bobby's only interest in life, it seemed, was money. I never appreciated as a child how tight things were for him or how difficult it was to make ends meet. I think he may have thought that when my grandparents died, my mother would inherit a lot of money. They left Kenya about 2 years after we did, at the height of the Mau Mau rebellion, and a lot of their wealth stayed behind, tied up in the house. It was difficult to sell and worth next to nothing in that climate of fear, and there would have been no point in shipping the furniture home, as they didn't have a house to move into, so the millions never materialized. At first they lived in a furnished flat in Regent's Park, then moved to another in Putney, but Grandpa was not well. He had had a series of strokes, and when he and my grandmother were staying in a hotel at the end of our road in Hadley Wood, he collapsed over pre-dinner drinks. I was sharing a room with Jenny, and I remember Lily running in to wake us in the morning, saying, "Come on, get up, your grandfather's dead." Afterward, my grandmother took herself off to live very comfortably in a grand hotel on the seafront in Brighton, where Colin and I went to visit her. Poor Colin, it was painfully obvious that she preferred me. She had always had favorites and made no attempt to disguise it. My mother grew up knowing that she was second best, that her twin brother John was her mother's favorite. It had done nothing for her confidence, and it did nothing for Colin's either. My beloved grandmother died when I was 13, about 6 months after Grandpa. She was only 58, but she suffered from a thyroid-related complaint. I remember going to the funeral, turning around in church, looking at my mother and thinking, "God, she's so beautiful," and then that I shouldn't be thinking such things about my mother at her mother's funeral. By the time Granny died, she had spent most of her money. She left £100 to each of us, not that Jenny or I ever saw ours, and I imagine rather more went to my mother, but nothing like the fortune Bobby might have hoped for. When the money came through, my mother spent it on a set of fine porcelain, which infuriated him. As children, we were convinced that the reason we had moved away from Wimbledon was because Bobby had fallen in love with a neighbor. She was German, called Ingrid, and had moved into a house 2 doors away from ours shortly after we had arrived in Victoria Drive. Ingrid was beautiful, glamorous, sophisticated, tall, dark, and vivacious, married to a short, stocky, rather solid German businessman called Wolf. He ran a company selling potash and often had to entertain customers in expensive restaurants and clubs in London, and frequently invited my mother and Bobby along too. He was quite nice, but she was the gregarious one, and he seemed to adore her. They had 2 young daughters, and she was the perfect housewife. She was a fantastic cook, she made the most delicious chocolate biscuits, and her children were perfectly behaved and dressed. The 2 families became good friends, and we children played together. But we could tell that something was not quite right in the way Ingrid and Bobby behaved with each other. I noticed that he would often make an excuse to go over to her house, and Ingrid would wear very low-cut dresses. I remember sitting in the car once, waiting to go somewhere with Bobby, and Ingrid leaning provocatively through the car window to chat to him. I have no idea when they started their affair, but Bobby bought Mummy a Triumph Herald, which I learned to drive on the lawn at Gosmore. I was conscious of an atmosphere in the house of silent fury and slammed doors. I climbed into the car one day and noticed a deep scratch on the windscreen. "Look," I said, pointing it out to my mother. She said a neighbor's wife had scratched it, but offered no further explanation. In fact, she knew that Ingrid had left it as a calling card for Bobby. She must have scratched it with her diamond ring after some romantic encounter. But my mother chose not to challenge what was happening under her nose. She denied it as she did everything else that was unpalpable. Ingrid remained her friend, and she, Wolf, and their children were frequent visitors. I felt angry on Mommy's behalf, but in some ways I was as frightened of her as I was of Bobby. She didn't confide in me, so I was in no position to help or even say anything to her. Sometimes in the school holidays, I would go to stay with June Blackiston, a friend from St. Martha's. Her parents lived in a pretty Northamptonshire village, and her mother bought milk in churns from the farm to make her own butter and cream. She also made the most delicious cherry pies I've ever eaten. But Jane would make me get onto her horrible pony and hit it over the rump so that it would race off and jump over huge branches that had fallen on the village green, secretly hoping, I have no doubt, that I would fall off. By some miracle, I never obliged. During the long summer holidays, Colin and I were often sent to Cornwall to stay with our grandfather on his farm near Lixkird. Grandpa Boyd was an extraordinary man, quite exotic. He rode a big Triumph motorbike, and we didn't see him much because he was always rushing off. We would take the train from Paddington and meet our grandmother, his estranged wife, at Truro. I didn't like her, and I'm not sure why we met her there. Maybe we had to change trains, and she came to make sure we didn't get lost. She went everywhere with her dachshunds and was very austere. We would say an awkward hello and then get back on the train and continue our journey. We had wonderful summers on the farm. We learned to milk the cows and helped take the churns on the tractor down the end of the lane where they were collected. We rode horses, fed the chickens, collected eggs, and were chased by pigs. There was no electricity on the farm, so we ate supper by the light of a paraffin lamp and took candles up to bed with us. It was very romantic. Grandpa had a Cornish couple living in the house to look after him. Mrs. Wills cooked everything with saffron, so we had yellow bread, yellow cakes, and yellow buns, strange but delicious. After supper, Grandpa would hop onto his motorbike and roar off to the pub for a pint. Some years later, when he felt he'd had enough of life, he drove to Bodmin Moor, parked his bike, and walked until he could walk no further. Wow. After about 3 years in Hadley Wood, we were on the move again to a huge 6-bedroom flat in Hurlington Court, a mansion block overlooking the Thames in Putney. I didn't know what my stepfather's motivation was and assumed he wanted to be close to Ingrid, who was still in Victoria Drive, but whom he saw as often as ever. But apparently the reason for the move was financial. Bobby was short of money again, and the house in Hadley Wood had nearly doubled in value, so he sold it and rented the flat. He bought himself a boat, and we spent a lot of time on the river. I even swam in it. Bobby once bet me 2 shillings I couldn't swim to a certain boat, so I jumped in, thought, of course I'm going to do it, came back thrilled, happy, and couldn't understand why everyone was staring at me with horror. I had cut my knee on a piece of glass getting out of the water, and blood was gushing down my leg. I had to be carried off to hospital and stitched up. Bobby's boat was a motor cruiser called Blue Boy, which was moored quite close to the flat and had a little dinghy to ferry us to and from it. We used to go on trips upriver to places like Hampton Court and have picnics on the way. One evening, Bobby wanted to take the boat out for a late-night jaunt, so we all piled in. He was steering, and my mother was in the galley making supper when Bobby shouted at Colin, "What's that ahead?" Like all the Boyds, Colin was nearsighted and said he couldn't see anything. The next minute there was the most sickening, ear-splitting crash as we plowed into a metal weir and the boat was impaled on a 2-foot length of metal. Thank God it was stuck. Otherwise it would have sunk like a stone and we would have drowned. My mother was scalded by a pan of boiling water, but miraculously no one else was harmed, just terrified. Bobby yelled at us to get out of the boat and stand on the weir while he blew the boat's horn until the weir keeper arrived to rescue us. We were made to swear on our graves that we would never mention what had happened to Grandpa Gamer Jones. In March 1961, I turned 17, and at the end of the summer term, with a sigh of relief, said farewell to St. Martha's. My parents had never been particularly interested in my education. University was never mentioned. So with 3 O-levels and no idea about what I might do before I married, which is all I had been prepared for, I left school. I had thought it might be fun to be an air hostess, but was told you needed to be very pretty and speak 3 languages. I didn't regard myself as pretty, and apart from English, I could only speak a little bit of French, so that was out of the question. The other obvious option was a secretarial course, but I didn't want to sit in an office all day. My only ambition was to get out of Hurlington Court and away from the dysfunctional family we had become. My mother knew someone who was quite senior at Elizabeth Arden, and she pulled a few strings to get me and my friend Jane Blackiston a job as apprentices in their beauty salon in Bond Street. In October, Jane and I moved into a house in Clareville Mews, just off Queen's Gate in South Kensington, which we shared with 2 other girls. The sense of freedom was intoxicating. No nuns, no Bobby, no tension. If I hadn't felt so guilty about abandoning my brothers and sisters, life would have been perfect.